King Henry VIII was never meant to be king, but somehow, despite preparing his entire childhood for a different fate, Henry managed to become one of the most well-known monarchs that have ever lived.
Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1491, as the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth York. During his early life, he studied theology in order to stay on course for a career in the church, while his brother of 5 years, Prince Arthur, was set to be the next ruler from the House of Tudor. Because he was preparing for a religious path, he learned several languages, including French, Spanish, and Greek. Henry loved to play sports and stay active, which kept him healthy throughout most of his early life. His brother, Prince Arthur, was engaged to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand II and Princess of Spain, when he was 2, until eventually they got married in November of 1501. Unfortunately, very soon after Arthur and Catherine's marriage, Arthur fell ill and passed away. The heir to the throne was now Henry. When he turned 17, he became king and married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, who was 6 years older than him. Though Henry and Catherine truly did love each other, a rarity in royal marriages, their union was first proposed by Henry VII in order to build an alliance with Spain. This meant Catherine's main jobs were 1. To fulfill her duty as queen and provide a male heir, and 2. To fulfill her duty as a Spanish royal and maintain the Spanish alliance. Unfortunately, she found little success in either endeavor. Though she gave birth to 6 children, only one survived, a daughter named Mary. On the other hand, Henry grew quickly out of favor with Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also Catherine's nephew. This had devastating consequences on the Spanish alliance, and this, along with Henry's frustration with Catherine for not having a son and his newfound infatuation with one of her ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, led Henry to seek an annulment. Divorces were not allowed in the Catholic Church. However, a marriage could be annulled if it was deemed invalid somehow by the Pope. Henry used the verse in the Bible to claim that the marriage was invalid because Catherine was his brother's widow, and that was the reason she couldn't bear a son. However, the Pope learned of Henry's interest in Anne and refused Henry the annulment, concluding that she was the real reason he wanted to separate. In the end, Henry broke away from the church and the influence of the Pope, insisting his marriage with Catherine was invalid. They separated, and 3 years later she passed away in 1536.
Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, was said to be very well educated and ambitious. Before Catherine, she was also lady-in-waiting to French Queen Claude, and moved to England in 1522. Henry began to court Anne Boleyn after his increasing frustrations with Catherine of Aragon, and when Anne refused to be one of Henry's many mistresses, he went as far as breaking from the church and bringing about the English Reformation just to be with her. During her 3 years as a queen, Anne failed to provide a son. Only one daughter, Elizabeth I, survived amongst all her miscarriages and stillborns. Although Elizabeth I would go on to be one of the longest-lived monarchs of England, females were not seen as valuable at the time she was born. Many people were also angry at Anne because of the losses they suffered due to the Reformation. Henry's final straw was a shift in affection from Anne to Jane Seymour, who was lady-in-waiting to both her and Catherine before her. The time period and situation were not on her side, and Anne was falsely accused on multiple accounts of adultery, treason, and incest. She was tried and then beheaded only 4 months after the passing of Catherine of Aragon on May 19, 1536, granted a sword beheading by her request.
Though Jane Seymour was betrothed to Henry on May 20th, 1536, the very day after Anne Boleyn's execution, his interest in her first began about 3 months prior. Gentle, chaste, and simple Jane was indisputably Henry's favorite wife. She was strict and formal, replacing all of Anne's lavish and extravagant decor and banning the French fashions she introduced to England. She was popular amongst the people because of the compassion she showed for the late Queen Catherine and her daughter Mary. She only involved herself in politics once, and Henry was so furious that he reminded her of Anne's fate when she, quote, meddled in his affairs. But most importantly, she gave birth to Edward IV, Henry's first and only surviving son, just 1 year after getting married. Unfortunately, she died several weeks later due to complications from the birth. Jane was the only wife to receive a queen's funeral, and Henry wore black for 3 months and mourned for 2 years before marrying again. Much later, when Henry died, he was buried next to Jane at St. George's Chapel at his own request.
After Henry mourned the loss of Jane, his next wife was Anne of Cleves, sister to William of Cleves, a German duke. Anne and Henry's relations were short-lived, and today she's really only known as the ugly wife who 16th century catfished King Henry. Though there was a slight political motivation behind his choice, Henry mainly chose Anne to be his wife because of how beautiful she looked in her portrait. But when they had met in person, he was disappointed by her looks. He was apparently so repulsed that he refused to consummate the marriage, and it was for this reason they are able to get an annulment. Because Anne consented to the annulment so easily, Henry gave her an extremely generous settlement. She stayed on good terms with stepdaughters Mary and Elizabeth, and even became good friends with Henry, known as the king's beloved sister. She may not have the most flattering reputation, but she dealt with Henry's tyranny for the shortest amount of time, lived a happy and lavish rest of her life, and outlived all of Henry's wives.
Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was cousins with Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, as well as the lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. After Henry's failed marriage with Anne of Cleves, he was keen on choosing a wife for himself rather than one for pure political gain. Said to be young, merry, and vivacious, Catherine caught his eye and they married on July 28, 1540. However, Catherine was accused of having numerous sexual relationships prior to and during their marriage. These included Francis Derham, whom she intended to marry before becoming queen, and Thomas Culpeper, who was a favorite courtier of the king and said to have had an affair with Catherine during marriage. Her relations were revealed by Thomas Cranmer, and both Derham and Culpeper were interrogated, tortured, and sentenced to death. Catherine was convicted and stripped of her title of queen 1 short year after the marriage, then beheaded 3 months later.
Catherine Parr was Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. She is best known as the one who survived living for over a year after Henry's death. Before meeting Henry, Catherine was widowed twice and almost married Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, before leaving him to marry King Henry in 1543. She was described as an intelligent, loving stepmother who was able to restore the relationships between Henry and his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who he had disowned. Because Catherine was very well educated and well cultured, her influence extended to her stepchildren as well. Furthermore, Catherine was a devoted Protestant, which led to conflict with religious opponents who tried to turn Henry against her. Because Catherine begged for forgiveness, she was forgiven and supported by the king. She continued to stay by Henry's side for about 5 years until he passed away. She was widowed once again, and after 6 months returned to marry Thomas Seymour.
Because Henry VIII had quite the eventful and tumultuous love and family life, many people tend to overlook his legacy as monarch. Specifically, the most important part of Henry's reign was the English Reformation, during which England broke apart from the highly influential and respected Roman Catholic Church. Although Henry had no particular issues with the Church, even receiving the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, for the pamphlet he wrote against the teachings of Martin Luther early on, he ran into a block when pushing through his divorce with Catherine of Aragon. In order to marry Anne Boleyn, the Act of Supremacy was passed, and Henry was officially declared the first supreme head of the Church of England, a title still held by English monarchs to this day. He dissolved monasteries, confiscating their money and selling their land on the grounds of punishing Catholicism, and all the profit gained went straight into the royal coffers. Henry significantly lowered the influence of the Church during a time wherein Europe was heavily Catholic. This not only affected English people's beliefs, but also brought about political and social changes that have lasted to the present day.
King Henry VIII was never meant to be king. Reckless and inexperienced, he faced many challenges throughout his reign, but he always had one main goal: to go down in history. And though it may not be for the reverence or glory that he had wished for, he certainly accomplished it with the help of the many women who were at his side throughout his lifetime.